a symbol of resistance against oppression. When we look back across the centuries, certain names refuse to fade into the silence of history. They live on, not because of wealth or monuments, but because of the courage they showed when the world demanded their surrender. One of those names is Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba. Today, nearly 400 years after she walked this earth, her story still burns brightly, not only in Angola, her homeland, but across the African continent and the African diaspora worldwide. And the reason is simple: Nzinga represents resistance. She represents a defiance so powerful that even empires trembled before her. To understand why people still talk about Queen Nzinga today, we must first step back into the brutal world she was born into. The 17th century was an age of chaos for Central Africa. Portuguese colonizers, armed with guns and driven by greed, were expanding their foothold on the continent. Their hunger was not only for land, but for people. The transatlantic slave trade was devouring entire communities, ripping men, women, and children from their homes and shipping them in chains to the Americas. For the kingdom of Ndongo, in what is now Angola, survival itself was under threat. Into this storm was born Nzinga Mbandi, the daughter of a king but destined for far more than royalty. From an early age, she displayed a rare combination of sharp intelligence and unshakable will. In a world where women were often sidelined in leadership, Nzinga refused to be sidelined by anyone. She learned statecraft, diplomacy, and the art of war, preparing herself for battles that would define her life and her legacy. People talk about Queen Nzinga today because her resistance was not just military. It was psychological, political, and cultural. She fought Portugal's armies on the battlefield, yes, but she also outwitted their governors in negotiation rooms. She understood that empire thrives on intimidation, and so she mastered the art of refusing to bow. One of the most famous moments in her life captures this spirit perfectly. In 1622, Nzinga was sent as an envoy to negotiate with the Portuguese governor of Luanda. When she entered the chamber, the Portuguese deliberately humiliated her by refusing to offer her a chair. They expected her to stand like a servant while they sat in comfort. Instead, Nzinga calmly turned to one of her attendants, who dropped to their hands and knees. She sat upon the attendant's back like a throne, meeting the governor eye to eye. In that moment, she sent a message that still echoes today. She would never accept inferiority. She would never negotiate as anything less than an equal. This act of defiance is why Nzinga is remembered. She did not just resist Portugal's weapons. She resisted their worldview, their belief in their superiority. She embodied dignity in the face of humiliation, power in the face of domination. Her resistance continued for decades. When diplomacy failed, she fought. She rallied armies, forged alliances with neighboring peoples, and even formed strategic partnerships with the Dutch to counter Portuguese power. She was not afraid to make hard choices. To protect her people and her throne, she used every tool available: intelligence, strategy, and sheer determination. For more than 30 years, she held back an empire that seemed unstoppable. So why does this matter today? Why do people still talk about her? Because Nzinga's defiance resonates far beyond her own time. Across Africa and the African diaspora, she has become a symbol of what it means to resist oppression in all its forms. For Angolans, she is a national hero. Statues of her stand tall in Luanda, inspiring pride and reminding the people of Angola that their nation was not built on surrender, but on resilience. Her story was passed down through generations, even during the darkest days of Portuguese colonization, as proof that resistance was possible. For the broader African world, Nzinga represents the courage to confront systems of domination, whether colonial, racial, or economic. During the struggles for independence in the 20th century, liberation leaders invoked her name. She became part of the language of resistance, a reminder that Africa had its own warriors, its own queens, who stood tall against invaders centuries before independence movements began. Even in the United States, the Caribbean, and Latin America, where the descendants of enslaved Africans carried memories of their stolen homelands, Nzinga's story struck a chord. She became a spiritual ancestor for those who demanded freedom and dignity in the face of slavery, segregation, and systemic racism. Her life proved that Africa's past was not one of weakness, but of extraordinary strength. But her legacy also sparks debates. Some historians point out that Nzinga herself sometimes participated in the slave trade, selling captives from rival groups in order to strengthen her own kingdom's survival. This complicates her story. She was not a saint, but a queen navigating the brutal realities of her time. Yet even this complexity adds to her legacy. It reminds us that resistance is not clean or perfect. It is messy, it demands compromise, and it often forces leaders to make impossible choices. Nzinga's greatness lies not in her purity, but in her determination to protect her people against overwhelming odds. Today, in an era where conversations about decolonization, racial justice, and women's empowerment are louder than ever, Nzinga's life has found new relevance. Feminist scholars celebrate her as a woman who broke the mold of patriarchal leadership, proving that strength and authority are not the monopoly of men. Activists see her as a reminder that standing against oppression is not only possible, it is necessary, and African nations highlight her story to reclaim history from the stereotypes of passivity and victimhood, showing that their ancestors were warriors, strategists, and leaders of extraordinary skill. Why do people still talk about Queen Nzinga? Because she embodies timeless human values: the courage to resist domination, the dignity to demand equality, and the intelligence to outmaneuver even the most powerful of foes. Her story is a reminder that history is not just about those who conquer. It is also about those who refuse to be conquered. Nzinga's legacy today is not just about Angola. It is about every community that faces oppression and chooses to stand tall. It is about every woman who refuses to be silenced. It is about every people who fight to preserve their dignity in a world that seeks to strip it away. And perhaps that is why her name still resonates, because in a world still filled with injustice, we need symbols of resistance. We need reminders that even when the odds are impossible, defiance matters. Queen Nzinga gave her people that symbol in the 17th century, and in the 21st century, her spirit still speaks, reminding us that true power lies not in domination, but in the refusal to surrender. A living icon in politics, feminism, and cultural identity, Queen Nzinga's story is not frozen in the past. Unlike many historical figures who are remembered only in books or in the quiet halls of museums, Nzinga lives on in the public imagination. Her legacy is not static, it is alive, shifting, and constantly reinterpreted in light of modern struggles. She remains relevant because she is not just history, she is a mirror, reflecting the values and battles of each generation. Nzinga and political identity in Angola. Nzinga is more than a memory, she is a national symbol. When Angola fought for independence from Portugal in the mid-20th century, nationalist leaders reached deep into the past to find sources of pride and inspiration. They needed figures who could unite the people, who could embody the courage required to fight an empire, and who better than the queen who once faced down Portugal herself. Her story became part of the narrative of Angolan resistance. Leaders invoked her defiance, her intelligence, her unwavering strength as proof that Angolans were never passive victims of colonization. Instead, they were heirs to a warrior queen who had resisted European domination centuries before. After independence in 1975, Angola enshrined Nzinga as a founding symbol of national identity. Statues of her were erected, streets were named after her, and her story was taught in schools. Even today, Angolans see her not only as a figure of the past, but as a constant reminder that their nation was built on resistance and resilience. This political legacy matters because nations are built not only on borders and governments, but on stories. Nzinga's story gives Angolans a shared anchor, a source of dignity amid the challenges of modern nationhood. And beyond Angola, her name continues to echo across Africa as proof that African resistance to European conquest did not begin in the 19th or 20th century. It has always been there, fierce and unbroken. Nzinga as a feminist icon in the modern global conversation, Queen Nzinga has also been embraced as a feminist icon. Her life challenges the stereotypes of African women in history. Too often, the narrative has painted women as passive, as background figures, as invisible in the shaping of nations. Nzinga smashes that stereotype completely. She was not only a participant in her kingdom's politics, she was its leader, its diplomat, its general, its strategist. She negotiated with European powers on equal footing. She led armies into battle. She commanded loyalty from men and women alike. In doing so, she shattered the boundaries of what was expected of women in her time. Today, feminist scholars and activists look to Nzinga as evidence that strong female leadership is not a modern invention, but a tradition with deep roots. They see in her a model of resistance against patriarchal systems, both colonial and indigenous. But what makes her even more compelling is her ability to combine diplomacy and ferocity. She was as comfortable using her intelligence in negotiation as she was wielding military power. This duality, the ability to fight and to persuade, offers a lesson for modern feminism. Strength takes many forms, and true power is found in the capacity to adapt. Her image has therefore become more than history. It is a symbol in women's movements across the globe, reminding us that the struggle for dignity and equality is centuries old, and that women have always been at the heart of resistance. The complexity of her legacy, but Nzinga's legacy is not simple, and that complexity makes her story even more alive. Critics point out that, in order to defend her kingdom, Nzinga sometimes engaged in the very systems she resisted. She took part in the slave trade, selling captives from rival groups in exchange for alliances and weapons. This reality complicates her image. Was she a liberator, or was she also a participant in exploitation? The truth is both. Nzinga was not a saint. She was a ruler in a brutal world, making choices to preserve her people's survival. And here lies the power of her legacy. She was human. She was a leader navigating impossible choices, balancing morality with survival. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, that resistance is rarely pure, and that even heroes are shaped by the violent systems they fight within. Modern historians see this not as a reason to dismiss her, but as a reason to take her more seriously. By understanding her complexity, we see her not as a flawless myth, but as a real leader, whose greatness was forged in the fire of impossible circumstances. Nzinga in the African diaspora. Nzinga's name also travels far beyond Angola. Across the African diaspora, especially in the Americas and the Caribbean, she has become a cultural symbol. For descendants of enslaved Africans, Nzinga represents a connection to an African past filled not only with suffering, but with power, dignity, and defiance. In the United States, during the Civil Rights Movement and the later rise of Black Power, Nzinga's story was rediscovered and celebrated. She became part of the pantheon of African leaders, like Shaka Zulu, Toussaint Louverture, and Haile Selassie, invoked to inspire pride and resilience among Black communities facing systemic racism. In Brazil and the Caribbean, where African cultural memory has survived in religion, music, and oral tradition, Nzinga is sometimes remembered as a warrior spirit, a symbol of ancestral strength. She is not just studied in classrooms, she is invoked in art, literature, and even spiritual practices. Her name thus lives on across continents, uniting people in a shared history of resistance and pride. Cultural representations from literature to film. Part of why Nzinga's story endures today is the way it is retold and reimagined in culture. Writers, artists, and filmmakers have all drawn upon her legend to inspire new generations. In literature, she has appeared in novels and plays that dramatize her defiance against Portugal. In music, African and Afro-diasporic artists reference her as a symbol of strength. In visual art, her image is often used to challenge colonial stereotypes, portraying African women not as passive figures, but as fierce leaders. Even in popular culture, her legacy surfaces. Netflix has produced content dramatizing her story, and global audiences are being reintroduced to her defiance in ways that resonate with modern struggles against inequality and domination. This cultural revival ensures that Nzinga's name is not confined to history books, but continues to inspire through the mediums that shape modern identity. Lessons for today's world. So why, in the 21st century, do people still talk about Queen Nzinga? Because her life holds lessons for today's struggles. For politics, she reminds us that small nations and marginalized people can resist even the mightiest empires with courage and strategy. For women, she stands as proof that leadership and strength are not confined to men, and that women have always been central to shaping history. For global justice movements, she embodies the fight against exploitation and inequality, reminding us that dignity is worth defending, even at great cost. For identity, she serves as a bridge connecting modern African and diasporic communities to a past rich with heroes, not just tragedies. Her relevance is not just academic, it is practical, emotional, and philosophical. She lives on because she speaks to the timeless struggle for justice, dignity, and freedom. Leadership lessons from a warrior queen. When modern audiences reflect on Queen Nzinga, one question often rises to the surface: what does her leadership teach us today? Her legacy is not simply about the battles she fought or the negotiations she won. It is about the qualities of leadership that allowed her to endure against impossible odds, and why those qualities continue to inspire leaders, thinkers, and ordinary people in the present. Leadership is always contextual. The challenges of 17th century Angola are not the same as those of the 21st century, yet the core human dilemmas, power, survival, resistance, dignity, remain the same. And in Nzinga's story, we find lessons that transcend time. The courage to confront empires. One of the first leadership lessons we draw from Queen Nzinga is courage in the face of overwhelming power. She inherited a kingdom threatened on all sides. Portuguese armies pressing from the coast, rival African groups competing for survival, and the devastating pressure of the transatlantic slave trade draining communities. Most rulers might have surrendered or sought safety through compromise. Nzinga refused. Her courage was not blind aggression. It was deliberate, strategic, and disciplined. She confronted Portugal not because she was reckless, but because she understood that submission would mean the erasure of her people. Leaders today, whether in politics, business, or activism, still look to Nzinga as proof that sometimes the ethical path is not safety, but resistance. In a world where global corporations dominate economies, where powerful nations still exert control over weaker ones, Nzinga's defiance resonates. She reminds us that leadership often means saying, "No," when everyone expects you to bow. The art of psychological strength. Nzinga's leadership was not only military, it was psychological. She mastered the ability to project strength, even when her position was precarious. The famous story of the chair during negotiations in Luanda is not just a moment of defiance. It is a masterclass in psychological leadership. By refusing to stand while the Portuguese governor sat, she asserted equality without speaking a word. She knew that leadership is as much about perception as reality. If her enemies perceived her as weak, her kingdom would be treated as weak. If she projected dignity, her kingdom would be treated with respect. Modern leaders study her for this reason. She demonstrated that leadership is not only about resources or armies. It is about presence, confidence, and the ability to command respect in hostile spaces. In today's world, where image and narrative shape global politics as much as force, Nzinga's mastery of psychological strength feels strikingly modern. Adaptability. A queen who could shift strategies. Another remarkable trait in Nzinga's leadership was adaptability. She was not rigid. She changed strategies when circumstances demanded it. At times, she negotiated treaties with the Portuguese to buy her kingdom breathing space. At other times, she waged all-out war. When alliances with neighboring states weakened, she turned to European rivals like the Dutch for support. When her kingdom's stability depended on internal reforms, she reorganized the state itself, relocating populations and restructuring her army. This adaptability is what kept her reign alive for nearly 4 decades in a hostile environment. Leadership, she showed, is not about clinging to one path. It is about knowing when to shift without losing sight of the greater goal. Today, in a rapidly changing world, whether in geopolitics, economics, or technology, Nzinga's lesson is urgent. Leaders must be flexible, but never lose their integrity. They must be willing to change tactics, but never abandon their people. The balance between diplomacy and force. Nzinga was a warrior queen, but she was also a master diplomat. Her genius lay in balancing these two domains. She knew when to sit across a table and when to ride into battle. In many ways, she embodied the duality of leadership, the lion and the fox. She fought fiercely when survival demanded it, but she negotiated skillfully when peace offered advantages. She never relied on force alone, nor on words alone. Instead, she wove them together into a strategy that kept her kingdom alive in the face of superior European weaponry and resources. This balance is one of the reasons she is still discussed in leadership seminars and historical analyses. It reflects a truth about human affairs: no leader can survive on brutality alone, nor on diplomacy alone. True leadership lies in knowing which to use, and when. The power of symbolism and story. Nzinga understood something profound: leaders are not just rulers, they are symbols. She cultivated her own legend in her lifetime. Her acts of defiance, her ability to command loyalty, her refusal to submit, all of it created a story that outlived her. Even today, much of what we remember about her is rooted in symbolic moments: the throne made of her servant's back, her alliances with unexpected partners, her image as the queen who could not be broken. These stories gave her power during her life, and they give her legacy power today. Modern leaders can learn from this. The stories people tell about you matter as much as your decisions. Nzinga carefully shaped her own myth, ensuring that her enemies saw her not as a weak African ruler, but as an equal adversary. That myth-making still inspires people centuries later. The complexity of real leadership. But perhaps the most enduring lesson from Queen Nzinga's leadership is that greatness is not perfection. She was not flawless. She made decisions that remain controversial, participating in the slave trade, punishing rivals harshly, and sometimes sacrificing morality for survival. This complexity does not diminish her legacy. It deepens it. It shows us that leadership is not about being ideal, but about navigating impossible choices. Nzinga's greatness lay not in purity, but in resilience. She carried the weight of her people's survival on her shoulders, and she bore it fiercely. Modern audiences find this honesty refreshing. In an age where we often expect leaders to be saints, Nzinga reminds us that true leadership is forged in struggle, compromise, and imperfection. Lessons for modern women leaders. Nzinga's leadership also holds specific lessons for women navigating leadership roles in male-dominated spaces today. She faced the same skepticism women still face centuries later. The belief that leadership belongs to men, that strength is masculine, that women must prove themselves twice as much. Nzinga shattered those expectations. She did not ask for permission to lead. She claimed leadership through action. She dressed for war, commanded armies, and negotiated with governors. She refused to be defined by gendered limitations. Today, women in politics, business, and activism invoke her name as proof that leadership is not gendered, it is earned. Nzinga's story becomes not just history, but a call to women everywhere: do not wait for recognition. Command it. Legacy in leadership studies. Today, scholars and educators around the world now include Queen Nzinga in case studies of leadership. She is discussed not only in African history classes, but in global courses on strategy, negotiation, and leadership ethics. Her story offers a unique case: a leader from the global south who confronted one of the most powerful European empires of her time, not with overwhelming resources, but with intelligence, adaptability, and courage. In a field often dominated by European and American examples, Nzinga offers a necessary balance, an African perspective on leadership that resonates universally. So why do people still talk about Queen Nzinga today? Because she offers timeless lessons in leadership. Her courage, psychological strength, adaptability, balance between diplomacy and force, mastery of symbolism, and resilience in complexity all speak to the challenges leaders face in every age. She was not perfect. She was not saintly, but she was formidable, strategic, and enduring. And it is that endurance, her refusal to be erased by empire, that makes her leadership resonant centuries later. Leaders today, whether presidents, activists, or ordinary individuals facing challenges, still look to Nzinga as proof that leadership is not about privilege or position. It is about will. It is about courage. It is about standing tall when the world demands you kneel. Nzinga's leadership remains alive today because it reminds us of a truth often forgotten: history is not only written by the conquerors, sometimes it is written by those who refuse to be conquered.